You are not weak. You are simply leaking. You consume more. You discipline harder. You try to become better every single day. And yet, something feels off. Not strong enough, not focused enough, not in control. And deep down, you already know. Something is broken. Not because you lack effort, but because everything you build is bleeding out, piece by piece. If you watched the previous video, 5 laws that cause power leaks, then you've seen it clearly. Your power is not taken from you. You drop it, in your words, in your exposure, in what you allow to get close. But this is where most people stop. They recognize the problem, but they don't know how to seal it. They see the leaks, but have no idea where to start. So they fall back into the same loop. Build more, still lose. Try harder, still weak. Here is the truth you must face. You don't need more power. You need to stop losing it. This video will not teach you how to grow. It teaches you something far more dangerous. How to seal the hidden leaks of your power that you've never even noticed. Not 10, not complex theories. Only 5 laws. 5 laws to stop power leaks. If you truly understand and execute, you won't need to become stronger. Because for the first time, everything you build will stay. Pause for a second. Ask yourself, if I stopped leaking energy every day, who would I become? If that question makes you go silent, then stay. Because from this point forward, you will never see yourself the same way again. Before you try to become stronger, understand this. Your problem is not lack. You think you lack skills, opportunities, time. Wrong. You are not lacking. You are losing every day. You build a little discipline, a little focus, a little progress. But at the same time, you are bleeding it out. Not all at once, piece by piece. One unnecessary conversation steals your focus. One extra explanation costs you status. One mindless scroll robs your time. Nothing dramatic, no collapse, only leaks. And that's why you feel it. You are not weak, but you are not getting stronger either. You are stuck, not broken enough to change, not sharp enough to break through. This is the most dangerous state, because you think you are fine. But the reality is, you are slowing down. You don't lose power in one grand decision. You lose it in the moments you don't notice. When you talk too much. When you react too fast. When you let the unnecessary get close. Every time it happens, you are training yourself. This is my standard. And over time, it becomes your identity. The most dangerous man is not the strongest. It is the one who no longer leaks. He doesn't do more than you, but what he builds stays, not scattered, not dragged down, not influenced. That's the difference. Pause for a second. Be honest. In a single day, how much do you actually keep, and how much do you lose? Write this down. I seal my power leaks, not to perform, but to start seeing. Everything you once called normal is quietly making you weaker. But this isn't the biggest mistake, because the moment you become aware, most people fall into a trap that sends them right back to the beginning. In the next part, we step into that mistake. The moment you realize you are leaking, Most people make a mistake. A familiar one, but lethal. They talk. They talk about their plans. They talk about their transformation. They talk about who they're about to become. I'll be more disciplined. I'm changing. I'll be different. It sounds right. It sounds powerful. But in reality, it is the fastest way back to zero. You think you're committing, but what you're actually chasing is something else. Validation. And your brain cannot tell the difference between execution and talking about it. The moment you speak it, the moment others react, the moment you get a hint of approval, your brain collects the reward before you've done anything. That's why you feel like you're progressing, when in reality, you haven't even started. You lose the pressure. You lose the urgency. You lose real drive. But that's not the most dangerous part. The moment you speak your transformation, you don't just affect yourself. You activate the environment around you. People who are comfortable with your old version will start reacting, not because they hate you, but because you are disrupting their stability. They won't say, "Don't change." They'll say, "Are you sure? Is that necessary? Take it slow." It sounds like care, but in truth, it's drag. A subtle force, but strong enough to hold you in place. And if you still need their agreement, you will stop. Here is the cold truth. The more people who know your plans, the less likely you are to execute them. Those who understand power don't do this. They don't talk. They don't announce. They don't explain. They simply execute in silence. And when they return, everything has changed. No need to prove. No need to explain. The results speak. Pause for a second. How many plans have you announced that you never completed? Not because you're weak, but because you spent the energy before it had the chance to grow. Write this down. I don't announce. I execute. Not to appear mysterious, but to preserve all your energy for building. And from here, we move into the system, not awareness. Laws. 5 laws to stop power leaks. We begin with the simplest one. Your words. From this point forward, we don't talk about awareness anymore. We move into laws. The first law, where 90% of men lose power without ever realizing it. Words, not big actions, but the sentences you speak every day. You don't lose power in a decision. You lose it the moment you start explaining. When someone asks, "Why did you do that?" you answer. When someone disagrees, you try to make them understand. When someone doubts you, you provide reasons. You think it's communication, but in reality, it's permission seeking. The moment you explain, you step out of control and into a different role. The one who needs to be accepted. And in that instant, power shifts. The other person doesn't need to be smarter than you. They only need one thing, you, needing their understanding. That's enough, because now they become the judge. They decide if you're right or wrong, if you're reasonable or not, if you deserve respect. You are no longer speaking. You are waiting for a verdict. Here is what most people never see. The more you talk, the more you expose your thinking, your reactions, your weaknesses. And once people can read you, they don't need to ask. They just control. The easy-to-read man is always the easy-to-lead man. On the other side, the man who speaks less becomes unpredictable. And in the architecture of power, unpredictability is leverage, not silence from weakness, but silence from control. You don't react immediately. You don't explain by reflex. You don't feel the need to clarify everything. You hold it. And what you withhold is what creates weight. Think back to the last time you over-explained. What were you trying to prove? And to whom? Write this down. I don't need to explain to proceed. Not for others to read, but to remind yourself you no longer require permission to act. But words are not the only place you lose power. There is something far more dangerous. Not what you say, but what you reveal. In the next part, we step into the second law. Why overexposure turns you into a target without you ever realizing it. Law 2. Exposure is the fastest way to become controllable. You were taught. Open up, share, tell your story. It sounds right. It feels human. But here is the cold truth most people won't say. Not everyone who listens to you is on your side. Some people are just observing. When you talk about your struggles, you think they empathize. But sometimes, they are just recording. When you reveal your weaknesses, you think you're being authentic. But in reality, you are handing them a map of how you think, a map of how you react, a map of where you can be hurt. And once someone has the map, they don't need to guess anymore. They know exactly where to press. Understand this. Not everyone wants to harm you, but many people will use what they know if it benefits them. Not because they're evil, but because it's human nature. The deepest wounds rarely come from strangers. They come from those who once had access to you. The ones you trusted. The ones who said, "I understand you." And that's why those who understand power don't make everything public. Not because they're fake, but because they are selective. They understand one thing with precision. Not every environment is safe for vulnerability. You don't need to share everything to be real. You only need to know what must be withheld and who has earned access. A strong man is not the one without wounds, but the one who knows where to store them, not displayed, not exploited, not turned into weapons against him. Pause for a second. Think about the last time you overshared. What were you looking for? Understanding? Validation? Or just a place to release? And did it actually make you stronger? Write this down. I don't need everyone to understand me, not to appear cold, but to start protecting what creates your power. But exposure is not the most dangerous leak. There is something more subtle. Not what you've done, but what you say you will do. In the next part, we step into the third law. Why speaking too early about your money and your vision is the fastest way to kill it. Law 3. Premature exposure is the fastest way to kill your advantage. You have a plan, a new direction, a big objective, and you feel the surge. You want to speak. You tell your friends. You post it online. You talk about your future before you've even touched it. It feels like momentum, but in reality, it's a trap. Your brain does not distinguish between execution and talking about it. The moment you say it, the moment people react, the moment you get a hint of recognition, your brain collects the reward. Without action, that's why you feel like you've done something, when in reality, you haven't even started. You lose the pressure, you lose the urgency, you lose real drive, and it gets worse. You begin to live according to the image you announced. You are no longer building. You are protecting the label, the one who will succeed. And that's when you slow down. No one sees it, but you feel it. You speak well. You think big. But you don't go far. Not because you lack ability, but because you've already spent the energy on premature exposure. Those who understand power don't do this. They don't talk about the money they'll make. They don't talk about the plans they'll execute. They don't talk about the path they're on. They hold it, not because they're secretive, but because they understand. What is spoken too early loses its momentum. They build in silence, and when the results arrive, no explanation is needed. No proof is required. It speaks. Pause for a second. How many plans have you announced that you never completed? Not because you're weak, but because you drained it before it had the chance to grow. Write this down. I don't speak before I execute. Not to appear mysterious, but to preserve all your energy for action. But premature exposure is still not the deepest layer. There is something even more direct, not inside you, but around you. In the next part, we step into the fourth law, why your environment and the people around you can silently drag you down without you ever realizing it. Law 4. Environment determines how much power you keep. You can be disciplined. You can be focused. You can understand all of this. But if you are in the wrong environment, everything you build will be pulled down. Not instantly, but slowly. One negative sentence, one meaningless conversation, one person who constantly complains, nothing dramatic, but enough to slow you down. Here's what most people fail to see. You don't have to be weak to be dragged down. You only need to stay close to people who have no intention of moving forward. They won't say, "Stop trying." They'll say, "Relax. Don't be so serious. Take it easy." It sounds normal, but this is how the environment recalibrates you. Subtle, constant, invisible, and over time, you begin to adapt. You speak less about your goals. You lower your standards. You accept the average, not because you want to, but because you don't want to be different. This is the cost of staying. Those who understand power don't argue. They don't try to change others. They do one thing. They leave. No noise, no explanation, no announcement. They reduce presence. They show up less, respond less, engage less. And slowly, they disappear from places that no longer fit. This is not coldness. This is selection. You cannot preserve power if you keep placing yourself in environments that weaken you. No matter how strong you are, the environment will win. Pause for a second. Look at the people around you. Are they pulling you up or holding you in place? You don't need to say it out loud. You already know. Write this down. I choose environments that match my standards. Not to cut off everything, but to begin. Moving in the right direction. But even if you control your words, control your exposure, and choose the right environment, there is still one final layer, the one that determines how long you can hold power. In the next part, we step into the fifth law, why your status is not built on what you do, but on what you refuse to lower. Even if you've mastered your words, controlled your exposure, chosen the right environment, there is one thing left, the one that decides whether you hold power or lose it, the moment life starts going your way. Law 5. Your status is defined by the standards you refuse to lower. Most people believe power comes from what they do. They do more, try harder, prove more. That's the mistake. Real power is not in what you do. It is in what you refuse, what you don't tolerate, what you don't accept. The line you never cross, backward. You say you have standards, but look closer. Under pressure, do you hold them? When rejected, do you lower them? When you fear losing an opportunity, do you compromise? This is where truth reveals itself. You don't lose power when you fail. You lose it when you lower your standards to fit the situation. Once, you tell yourself it's fine. Twice, it becomes pattern. And from that point, people start learning how to treat you, not based on what you say, but based on what you tolerate. If you are flexible, you will be pressed. If you step back, others will step forward. If you allow exceptions, you will live inside exceptions. Those who hold power don't need to speak much. They only need to hold the line. No explanations, no reactions, no adjustments. They don't control others. They control their own standards. And over time, everything around them begins to recalibrate. People change how they approach. Opportunities change how they appear. Environments change how they operate. Not because they force it, but because they are no longer compatible with anything lower. This is the final divide. The weak constantly adjust themselves to fit the world. The strong hold their standards until the world adjusts to them. Pause for a second. Be honest. How many times did you know you should say no, but you said yes anyway? Not because you wanted to, but because you were afraid to lose. But in that exact moment, you already lost. Not the opportunity, your position. Write this down. My standards are non-negotiable, not to perform, but to begin building something no one can take from you. A version of yourself that cannot be shaken, cannot be influenced, cannot be pulled down. And when you reach this point, you realize something. You don't need to become stronger. You only need to stop losing yourself. You've seen the entire architecture. You are not lacking power. You are bleeding it out. Through your words, through your exposure, through what you reveal too early, through the environments you stay in, and through the standards you keep lowering. None of it feels big, but together, it shapes who you become. That's why you feel it. You try so hard, but you don't go far. Not because you're weak, but because you can't hold what you build. And if you don't change that, you can learn more. You can do more. You can discipline yourself harder. The result stays the same, because you're building on a system full of leaks. Understand this. Power does not come from what you add. It comes from what you retain. Retain your silence. Retain your focus. Retain your standards. And eliminate everything that makes you weaker. No 10 steps. Just one decision. Seal the leaks. Not tomorrow. Now. You don't need anyone to know. You don't need to announce. You don't need to prove. Just move differently, slightly, but consistently. Write this down. I seal my power leaks, not for others to see, but to become the man who can hold himself. And from this point, everything changes. Not loud, but irreversible. I'll see you in the next video.